Hello and welcome back to Projector at the London Film Festival. If you missed my first episode about Mogul Mowgli and the Disciple, be sure to catch up with it. On this episode, we'll be looking at the first instalment in Steve McQueen's small axe anthology, Mangrove, the Israeli romantic comedy Honeymood, and Clare Dunne builds a home for her family in the new film from the director of Mamma Mia herself. But of course, we start off with Mangrove. In 1968, Frank Crichlow, played by Shaun Parkes, opens the Mangrove restaurant in London's Notting Hill, which becomes a significant hub for the local black community, but is repeatedly harassed and raided by the Metropolitan Police. Crichlow, with the aid of British Black Panther movement leader Altheia jones-lecointe, played by Letitia Wright, organises a protest march to stop the discrimination, which the police respond to aggressively. Crichlow and jones-lecointe, along with Malachi Kirby's Darcus Howe, Rochenda Sandall's Barbara Beast, Nathaniel Martello White's Roden Jordan, Richie Campbell's Rothwell Kentish, Jermaine Hunter's Godfrey Millett, Rupert Boyce and Anthony Innes are arrested and charged with incitement to riot and affray, and made to stand trial at the Old Bailey, which they used to expose corruption and prejudice within the police. Mangrove is the first instalment in the Small Axe anthology series, which is a co-production between the BBC and Amazon that's created, co-written and directed by 12 Years a Slave director Steve McQueen, and is all about real-life stories of black British history. And if you're wondering where the title comes from, it's from a West Indian proverb: if you're the big tree, then we are the small axe. And that's very fitting for Mangrove in particular, which is all about the black community coming together to take down institutionalised racism. Other entries include Lover's Rock, which was added very late to the London Film Festival schedule and will be covered in another episode, and Red, White and Blue, which stars John Boyega and has premiered at other film festivals. This actually poses a bit of an interesting question as to whether or not this qualifies as film or television, and that distinction has got rather murky in recent years, especially as TV enjoys a renaissance and has incorporated a lot of cinematic language in it. And for my money, I would say that Mangrove is very much a film. It's structured and paced like one, and also it's certainly got the length. It's 127 minutes. That's not an episode of television in anyone's book. And essentially Small Axe is just a series of thematically connected films that just happens to be airing on BBC One. So does that make that television by default, even though it is made like a movie in every other way that we read them? Regardless of how you determine this, this is still one of the most important works of 2020. When Frank Crichlow first opened the Mangrove in 1968, a West Indian themed restaurant, I don't think he could have predicted or realised just how important it would be to the black community living in Notting Hill right up until its closure in 1992, many of that community brought over by the Windrush. And in that way, it very quickly becomes more than simply being a restaurant. It becomes this huge communal hub, somewhere for people to gather together and feel safe. And then later on, in light of the repeated harassment by the Metropolitan Police, it becomes something else once again. It becomes a representation of that entire community and their right to exist. And there, I think that Shaun Parkes' performance as Crichlow really shows how fantastic it is. It's a quiet performance, but one filled with nuance, because Crichlow may be fighting for himself and his business, but he's also aware that it's actually become more than that. And certainly he carries that weight on his shoulders, carrying the expectations of an entire community and their survival. And in that way, I think that Parkes' performance is really fantastic, especially in the second half of the movie, in its quieter moments where you can really see that evident, especially in his eyes. It's a really genuinely fantastic turn. And much of the first hour of the movie is about the restaurant and what it meant to the community. It's a place that's depicted as being lively and electric and dynamic and filled with joy and vibrancy. McQueen's direction feels passionate. You can tell that he wants to pay tribute to such influential people and such an important place. But also McQueen wants you to feel deeply angry at the injustice, as much time is focused on the police and how corrupt they are. In particular, PC Pulley, played by Sam Sproul in a fantastically slimy performance, who embodies the absolute worst excesses of the police at that time that regarded black people as being criminals merely by their existence and hunted them for sport, literally in one sequence where they're playing cards and someone draws an ace of spades, so they go out and try to arrest the very first black person they see. It's clear that Pulley in particular is targeting the Mangrove because he doesn't want them to have a space for themselves. He doesn't want them to feel comfortable on the streets of which they live, and even though there is no justification for raiding the Mangrove repeatedly under the pretense of drugs and other criminality, it happens time and time again. And over the course of that first hour, you can feel the tension building up to the protest. The key protest march sequence of the film's midway point is easily its most memorable, but also most important, and has only become more relevant and timely since the film was shot. Ever since then, we've had the Black Lives Matter protests, and it feels like history is repeating itself. Many of the scenes that we see in Mangrove echo those that we saw in American cities where peaceful protests were met by police brutality and violence, so much so that it feels almost too close to the bone to watch it in this movie, but it does feel like the right time to tell this particular story, even if the filmmakers weren't aware of that when they set out on it. And this sequence is especially well done. It puts you right there on ground level, and also McQueen knows how to get a really striking image. There are some fantastic pieces of cinematography all throughout this movie, but one of the most memorable is Jones-lecointe getting on top of a car to make a speech, and she's reflected on the front of it as rain drips down. That's an especially striking moment. Another one is later on when there are people protesting outside the trial, and they're reflected as the judge coldly looks down upon them. It's very, very memorable and also good storytelling here. The second half of the movie is about the subsequent trial of the Mangrove Nine, as they came to be called, and when I realised the back half of the film was going to be courtroom drama, there was a part of me that became a little bit worried, because those kind of stories can be quite dry and procedural, and because of that, quite predictable. But McQueen directs this so well that it reminds you of the positive virtues of courtroom drama, namely having all the facts laid out and put to account and seeing justice be done. And that is especially true in this case, where the trial, and it spans over 10 weeks, becomes an extended form of protest in of itself. Under their lawyer, played fantastically by Jack Lowden, they adopt a deliberately disruptive defence, especially in trying to point out how unfair the system is. This begins with them trying to deliberately reject jurors and have an all-black jury, but also several of the defendants represent themselves, in particular Darcus Howe and Altheia jones-lecointe, and this means that they get to personally cross-examine the witnesses and get their own voices, and that makes it especially satisfying when they get to interrogate the police officers at the scene, and Pulley in particular. The great moment where Howe pulls apart Pulley's testimony is easily one of the most satisfying scenes of the year. And that sequence, along with many others in the trial section of the film, are shot and edited very tightly by McQueen, who really invests you in the action and makes it feel like a battle where every victory and every concession is hard won. This is McQueen at the top of his directorial powers. Also, courtroom trials are inherently dramatic, and that means that it gives the actors plenty to play, and this has a fantastic ensemble cast, all of which are given a moment to shine here. But particular highlights amongst them include the top-billed Letitia Wright of Black Panther, now playing the leader of the British Black Panthers, Altheia jones-lecointe. You've also got Malachi Kirby as Darcus Howe, and Line of Duty's Rochenda Sandall is especially good here as well. The cast through and through is fantastic. Even on its own terms, away from the rest of the collection, Mangrove is a powerful, brilliant piece of work that is one of 2020's most important films. It's a movie that has its finger right on our current pulse right now and reminds us that those battles were hard fought and are still being fought for, and also that maybe we haven't come far on as we thought. This has a terrific ensemble cast, but McQueen is the true accomplishment here, because if this is the standard he sets for the entire Small Axe series, then that means that regardless of whether you qualify it as film or television, it is the most important work of 2020, period. The idea that McQueen made not just one of the most important films of the year, but 5 of them? That is genuinely next level, and I look forward to seeing if that's the case. Mangrove will air on BBC One as part of the Small Axe anthology series in the UK and on Amazon Prime in the US in November. Next up, a newlywed couple have a very long wedding night in the romantic comedy Honeymood. Noam and Eleanor, played by Danker and Avigail Harari respectively, have just got married and check into their lavish hotel suite. But instead of a perfect night of newlywed bliss, the pair start to fight, especially once Eleanor finds an envelope in Noam's back pocket left by his ex Renana, played by Ruthie Yale Folman, that contains a ring. Determined not to start their marriage cursed, Eleanor takes Noam across the streets of Jerusalem to find Renana so that he can return the ring, beginning a long night of chaos and misunderstandings that will put their relationship to the test. Honeymood is the second feature from Israeli director Tayla Lavie, whose last film, 2014's Zero Motivation, was a big festival favourite that year, garnering a number of Israeli Film Academy Awards, as well as winning the Nora Ephron Award at the Tribeca Film Festival for its writing. That's quite fitting, actually, because her follow-up Honeymood is the kind of movie that Ephron herself probably would have been proud of writing. It's very much in rom-com territory here, but it's after Happily Ever After, and after, presumably, a big, lavish, expensive wedding, moving into this enormous luxury hotel room. At first glance, it looks like perfect wedded bliss, but it soon turns out to be anything but, starting with Eleanor asking Noam to carry her into the room in a romantic gesture that takes them several tries, and then they end up being locked out of their hotel room before they even get to consummate their marriage. And that sets in motion the comedy of errors of the rest of the plot. And I found myself, right from the opening of the film, chuckling away, because I honestly found this to be quite charming, and I think that's in large part because of the performances of the two leads. I think that Avigail Harari and Danker are really well cast here and play off each other beautifully. You can tell they've got a lot of chemistry together, especially in the film's earliest moments in their hotel room, where effectively it's a two-hander and they're playing these characters that are virtually opposites of each other. On the one hand, you've got Eleanor, who is quite impulsive to the point of being reckless and sometimes easily frustrated, and on the other hand, you've got Noam, who is calmer, more rational, but also more cynical. And at least at first, it seems like these two shouldn't be together, and that's the whole point. Now that the ceremony's gone, they finally got the time for themselves, and they find themselves questioning if they really are right for one another. It was a very quick romance. They both left their respective exes, and it was a whirlwind romance. And now reality has started to set in, and that insecurity is what powers the narrative and the farce. One of the things that works very well about Lavie's script, which is very well performed by the actors, is that it very purposely evokes the spirit of classic screwball comedy. Yes, there are moments where Honeymood gets a little bit raunchier than one of those, but for a lot of it, its spirit is very much classical. It feels like the kind of thing that Cary Grant would have been in, especially with the escalating mishaps and misunderstandings along the way, and how each argument and each comic set piece flows into the next. I liked that energy and rhythm. It's something that, honestly, I haven't seen in a lot of rom-coms recently. They often feel quite contrived, whereas this actually felt very natural and free-flowing, and I chuckled a lot at some of the gags. One of my favourite running gags is their wedding present, the iRobot, which is basically a robotic vacuum cleaner that ends up sucking up the ring and then they can't get it back out again. So Noam has to spend a good chunk of the running time carrying this oversized piece of electronic tat, carrying the teeny tiny tiny ring inside, and when you combine that with its ridiculous name that gave me a laugh every time they said it, the sight of him just carrying it alone became an amusement, and that, I think, shows the sort of well-observed absurdity that powers a lot of the humour in this film, especially once it moves out of the hotel room onto the streets of Jerusalem. From that point forward, it starts to show more influences, in particular Martin Scorsese's After Hours and John Landis's Into the Night. The idea that when night falls, that is when the crazy people come out, but also the kind of intimacy as well that comes with being all alone at night. And so you have these situations where they find themselves with very bizarre, unusual circumstances, like they're riding around in a taxi and then suddenly the driver stops and asks Noam to bless his child because he's in the hospital. And it's that sort of humour that I think translates really well. Even though this movie is subtitled, I never felt like that was a barrier. Not even the fact that there are parts of Honeymood that are very much based in Israeli and Jewish culture, but it feels so very accessible. And I think a lot of that is because it's so based in those rom-com trappings. There is something quite familiar about it, even with the change of location. And I think that is why the movie works so well. And even when I think it gets a little bit unsteadier on its feet, I think it eventually wins us back over, largely because of the charm of the leads, but also the material itself. I do think the second half of the movie is weaker, in large part because it separates the leads. They end up going on two divergent paths, but both of them essentially have to confront each other's respective exes. Noam, in particular, has a lot of trouble with Eleanor's ex, Michael, who is this very pretentious film student who is looking for feedback on his short that he's working on all night, but he's clearly still carrying a torch for Eleanor and is trying to sabotage her new relationship. There are some funny bits that come out of that. Likewise, a moment where Eleanor bumps into some guards and they have this impromptu dance number has the same spark as some of the film's earlier scenes. It's just that a lot of this second half feels like an extended version of the second act breakup. The characters start getting more introspective about what they want, especially once Noam visits his parents, who are never quite approving of his relationship with Eleanor, even though he spent so much money on the wedding. But it never feels like the outcome is in doubt. Even though the movie throws in some more roadblocks, in particular a suicidal nurse that Noam becomes infatuated with, it felt like the two performers had such strong chemistry that you wanted to see them get together in the end. And that is a mark of a good romantic comedy, especially as the two characters slowly make their way back to the hotel room. But it just feels like because they're not together, a lot of the early magic is missing from that portion of the film. A lot of it came from their chemistry. The movie also starts to feel a bit contrived as it moves towards the ending, especially in the climax where it gathers together all the characters and some of them are acting very zanily and they're doing things that if people did them in real life, you probably wouldn't be able to forgive them for it. And it feels like at that point, the film's comedy has become a bit too broad and OTT. A lot of the reason why Honeymood worked, at least initially, is because it felt grounded, even though it was a little bit absurdist. But even with that being said, in its final moments, Honeymood did actually win me back over. I think that Honeymood is a good example of a recent rom-com that understands why the genre works. It clearly acknowledges the debt that it owes to its predecessors and understands that a lot of the reasons why rom-coms work come down to a witty script and two great leads. And Honeymood provides that. I think that even if you're not traditionally a fan of subtitled films, this is well worth watching. It's certainly better than a lot of rom-coms I've seen in a long time. Many recent examples feel very forced and very artificial. Honeymood, in its best moments, feels genuine and authentic, and yes, romantic. It also feels like the kind of movie that would be perfectly suited to an English language Hollywood remake. So if that's the case, you should probably watch this one first. Honeymood will be released at some undetermined point in the future. Finally, we close up with Clare Dunne, who is building a home for herself and her family. Sandra, played by Clare Dunne, has escaped her abusive husband Gary, played by Ian Lloyd Anderson, and lives in temporary hotel accommodation with her daughters Emma and Molly, played by Ruby Rose O'Hara and Molly McCann respectively, but faces a long wait in the housing system. After learning she could build a home for €35,000, Sandra plans to secretly erect a place for her family, with Harriet Walters Peggy, who Sandra works for as a cleaner, generously offering a plot in her garden. With the aid of builder Ido, played by Conleth Hill, and her friends and helpers, Sandra sets about making her dream a reality. Herself is the newest movie directed by Lydia Lloyd, best known for Mamma Mia and The Iron Lady, but this is a much smaller project than those. The film is also produced by Sharon Horgan, star of the TV series Catastrophe, but the real creative force behind it is Clare Dunne, who not only stars in it, she also wrote the screenplay. She was inspired by the fact that one of her friends became homeless and how frustrated she was at that, but also by a Guardian article about someone who built their own house very cheaply using rudimentary DIY skills, combining the two together to create the premise. And Dunne didn't write this as a starring vehicle for herself. She actually envisioned this being passed on to a name actor because she's a stage performer, but Lloyd convinced her to star in the film herself, and that was absolutely the right call to make. Dunne is phenomenal in this movie. It's a star-making performance if I ever saw one. Dunne, who has a very distinctive birthmark under her eye, perfectly captures the character of Sandra in all her love, her hurt, but also her strength. And that's what the movie is about. It's about someone rebuilding themselves as they build a house, which is not a particularly subtle metaphor, but it certainly works. And that idea of rebuilding and healing is something you see all across the film, not only mentally in Sandra's case, but also physically. There are actual scars from her domestic violence, in particular a broken wrist, that heal all across the running time. And it's a movie that is very much about the determination and the resiliency of women, the ability to get back up again and keep fighting for one's family and for one's kids, and to put a roof over their home. If nothing else, the movie is certainly a very stark critique of the housing system and how it leaves people in places like airport hotels, like Sandra is in this film, where they struggle to provide for their family and are even ostracized for being there. The hotel refuses to let Sandra enter through the front entrance and instead advises her to use the back stairwell to avoid embarrassment. The housing and welfare system is criticised further for the fact that it's overly bureaucratic and inefficient, with Sandra going to various properties only to realise that many of them are frankly uninhabitable. When Sandra goes to them asking for the money for the house up front, arguing that it's cheaper than what they pay her for an entire year, and they'd be able to make a profit out of it by charging her rent, they reject her out of hand. It's characterised as a system that is overly dedicated to form-filling and easily abused and manipulated, not doing nearly enough for the most vulnerable people in its care. And if that makes it sound like Herself is a quite tough movie to watch, it really isn't for the most part, but it is based in some harsh realities. But there's also some moments of optimism as well, largely provided by Sandra's children. The two child performances in this movie are some of the most natural, authentic, unaffected child performances I've seen in any movie, and that's a credit to Lloyd's direction and Dunne's performance. They are two rays of sunshine in this movie, and that immediately makes you understand where Sandra gets her strength from going up against this system, but also her drive and determination to make sure that she does the best for them. It is worth noting the film starts with a very shocking scene of domestic violence that, while relatively brief, is brutal and will be harrowing, especially to those who've experienced it firsthand. I think the scene is very much narratively necessary. Certainly it's something that resounds throughout the entire rest of the narrative. Sandra flashes back to it time and time again throughout the rest of the movie, and certainly it informs the audience's interactions with Gary in his subsequent appearances. Sandra has to share custody of their children, and every time she has to hand over the children to him, we worry that he might do something to them because we know precisely what he's capable of. We, like Sandra, are scared. We are afraid of him. He keeps trying to reconnect and patch things up, claiming that he's got better control of his anger and that he is in a much better place now. But we don't believe him, especially as he becomes increasingly more passive-aggressive as time goes by. It's clear that he is a particularly manipulative person that has been chipping away at herself and her self-esteem for a very long time. But I want to make clear that even though we see the worst of humanity in this film, we also see the best of it, in that Sandra doesn't just build the house by herself, she does so with the kindness of friends, of co-workers, and of absolute strangers, people who have taken the time out of their day to join her in this task and help her in her hour of need, and help her with her goal and ambition, not for any gain out of themselves, but just simply to do the right thing, to do an act of kindness and generosity. And in that way, it does feel life-affirming. It does manage to raise your opinion of people, because not everyone is like Gary. There are good people out in the world, many more outnumber those, and that helps Sandra on her journey throughout the way. And I think that that shows that even though this story goes into some very dark places at times, it also shows that there is a lot of positivity out in the world, and there is a quite uplifting element to the story, especially seeing all that teamwork and camaraderie. That is, I think, one of the major themes of the movie, is learning to rebuild our trust in other people as well. However, it's in that theme where the movie starts to feel a bit contrived. In particular, Harriet Walters' Peggy. There's nothing actually wrong with Walters' performance. She's actually one of the highlights of the film, playing this cantankerous older doctor who initially refuses to let Sandra take care of her broken leg, another thing that heals throughout the running time, but later goes on to be one of her greatest allies, in particular giving her the land for the house. But I particularly take umbrage with that plot point, because let's face it, a lot of people with Sandra's position in real life aren't going to be lucky enough to have a rich friend of their mother's with an enormous garden that they can just give away the land to. And the movie tries to rationalise this by implying that Peggy has her own grief that she's dealing with, that she's settling by giving that land to Sandra to build a house on. But even so, it feels like an artifice. Likewise, the idea that Sandra's building this house, but doing so entirely in secret, strains credibility. And as the movie moves on towards a custody battle in its third act, the plotting seems more like something out of a soap opera. It feels like a storyline that should be taking place on Coronation Street at points. But nevertheless, the scenes in the trial, I think, are really well done and feature some of Dunne's best acting throughout the entirety of the film. And also, because Dunne is so good in the role, you still emotionally connect with the material. I still found myself, even though I was a bit disbelieving of the circumstances, still completely engaged with Sandra as a character and what she's going through and her frustrations at being forced to go through all the pain that she spent so long trying to push herself beyond. But easily the biggest problem with the film is the ending. It goes on for 5 to 10 minutes too long. There is a point where the movie has all but concluded. It should be playing the end credits, And then suddenly, there's this 11th hour twist that is totally unnecessary. I understand why the filmmakers decided to do this. They were obviously worried that if they went with a straightforward happy ending, it would be too saccharine, it would feel false. But honestly, to do this feels incredibly cruel. And I know that thematically speaking, the spot where Sandra ends up at the very end of this movie continues the ideas that is carried all throughout its running time, but even so, it can't help but end the film on a really sour note, and I don't think that was really meant to be the intention of the filmmakers, but I feel like it's not very satisfying to the audience, especially given the journey that we and Sandra have gone through during the storyline. There are some parts of this movie that are really, really bleak, and so you needed to have the optimism of that kind of ending to offset it. And instead, it feels like the filmmakers don't give the audience proper emotional catharsis and closure at the end of the film. Herself is a solid female-led drama both in front and behind the camera, with a fantastic performance by Clare Dunne, who makes the movie worth watching almost just for her, and I look forward to seeing her in future projects. She also provides a good script that is well performed and well directed by Lloyd that definitely has a lot to say about the issues that it raises and broaches a delicate subject with sensitivity. The problem is that ending, though, because I think that that is what the audience is going to be coming out of the movie carrying, and as such, it undoes some of the good work that came before, and it really is a shame, because that means that I don't know if I can wholeheartedly recommend this movie unless you walk out about 5 minutes from the end. The filmmakers clearly wanted to make an uplifting movie, but it's a pity they couldn't have committed to that wholeheartedly. Herself was scheduled to be released in UK cinemas in October, but that's been cancelled due to cinema closures and will be released at an undetermined date in the future. I'll be back with more coverage of the big films at this year's London Film Festival, but if you like this video and you want to support my work, then you can do so over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.